All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around and thanks to SANS for the opportunity to present. I am part of an OT cyber engineering group. We're under an engineering function, so I am an engineer proper. So my background's electrical engineering from Penn State. I got into Bechtel about 15 years ago and have been in the engineering function the kind of the whole time here. And here, so working at Bechtel, we're an EPC company, so engineering, procurement, construction, and then we also go into startup and commissioning before we turn it over to someone else to operate the facility. So I've been fortunate enough over my career to have the ability to take part in all the phases here. In the beginning of my career, I had a short stint. I actually get thrown right into construction field engineering. Being an electrical grad, they had need to do work packages, field changes at a site. So I got thrown right into that. But most of my career has been under engineering kind of procurement, the design engineering phase. So that's where we're identifying requirements, we're doing design drawings, and then kind of transitioning over to creating specifications and material requisitions to turn over to different suppliers. And typically on our projects, we'll have a very large DCS system as the main control. And then we have smaller third-party package systems that integrate back into that. So we work with lots of different suppliers, providing all these design requirements and working, through. And then once we get through the procurement, we'll go into construction. Everything is getting shipped to site. All the different engineering disciplines are working on their different packages, integrating them. And then the startup is coming in later, doing their energization, loop testing, doing any configuration changes. And recently, that's kind of where I've been focused on a lot, from the site acceptance testing, and then earlier on, before it gets shipped, doing factory acceptance testing. So when I saw the call for presentations for this, the two controls that kind of stuck out to me, and it really is because of a lot of the work I'd been doing over the past couple of years. Asset management has been a big challenge. And there are tools out there that you feed network traffic to, you can feed logs to, and you start populating things. But a lot of the controls that we see, especially on the US side, are tracking those assets through all these different phases of design up until we turn it over. So really critical control number two, and this is going to be very hyper focused on asset inventory. So asset identification and inventory for at least the crown jewels. And then I highlighted down in, because this will tie into control number 5, because a lot of what this asset inventory is focused, as we're going through these different phases, is, tracking different vulnerabilities and things that will come up, in the entire life cycle, which could be, several years when you're designing, constructing, and turning it over. So I highlighted overwhelming here, and that'll come into play a little bit later as we start talking through this, and talking about vulnerabilities and applying a risk-based approach to those vulnerabilities. So I'm based out of the US up in Northern Virginia. A lot of the work that I do is for the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, where I'm in Bechtel's Nuclear Security and Environmental Group. I also support our energy group, which does oil and gas and other projects. But these are just a list of different standards, regulations, frameworks, guidance documents that are, this is basically all the different sections that talk about asset inventory. So it's really just showing that, all these different guidance documents, you talk about having asset inventory baselines, having some type of change control, inventory registers. The technical report from the ISA 84 has a lot of good information actually on different phases and, where asset inventory comes into play throughout those different phases. A lot of the work, the projects that I have, we are, have to be compliant with NIST 853 and 82. And when I early in my career started getting involved with ICS cybersecurity, it was on nuclear generation, so commercial nuclear plants in the United States. So back then, there was the 10 CFR 7354, which was talking about, it's basically the cyber rule, developing a cyber program for all these commercial nuclear plants. And part of that is identifying the assets that must be protected against cyber attacks. And, there was additional guidance that came out, this Reg Guide 571 and NEI 0809. Both of those kind of derived from NIST 853. And, in all of these cases, component inventory is a big highlight. So, being on the engineering side, and I guess this is, I've heard from IT and, engineers, OT, there's a lot of arguments against doing asset inventories, or at least this is where you start to get questions, because a lot of times the focus tends to be with the main design of your system and just getting everything functional. So these things get punted down. But with this, you'll hear things, and you might have said these things, I might have said these things, suppliers, vendors, everybody. So asset inventory will never be 100% accurate, or too many resources needed to maintain. Or we'll have software that'll do this eventually, and we're not really doing anything with this until it gets turned over. There's really there's not a lot of thought sometimes in the supply chain risk that goes along with it as you're going through all these different phases, and lots of different companies involved, providing this equipment, integrating it, giving it to another company. So I think with this, what I really wanted to get to is the kicking the can part. So I think that's, really what happens a lot is there's a lot of, if you're on the security side, you're thinking about maybe some other more sophisticated kind of cyber requirements that you have to implement on your control system. Or, if you're on the engineering side, you're just worried about how are we making this, the system functional. And, if you kind of notice by the talk title, it's we kind of bookend, inadvertently bookended with Kubrick references. I like movies a lot. I, always watch movies, it's, I never really got into sports, unsurprisingly. So I know a lot of people talk about, Jurassic Park as an example of, with security there, you have Dennis Nedry, and you have they're so focused on dinosaurs, you don't think about the security. But if anybody's ever seen the movie Explorers, I grew up in the 80s. This is a good, I think it still holds up. So if you have kids, nephews, nieces, I think this is a movie that's really cool to show younger generations. So this is a movie where these kids start to have dreams, which turn out to be messages on how to build their own spaceship and go out in space. And, you can watch to see what happens. But part of this movie is when they're about to take their first flight, they have one of the characters is kind of like a science focused like character. And then you have one that's more mechanically inclined. And then the other kid is more just, I like sci-fi movies, I want to be an astronaut kind of a thing. But they're about to take their first flight, and the science character is just saying, okay, we got to do all these checks. We have to make sure that we have air. We got to do all these things. And the other two are saying, let's just go, 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 go. And I think that's what happens a lot with, this asset inventory, is it gets kind of sidelined. There's a lot of different competing requirements and designs. So it tends to get pushed down. And I think, getting back to the overwhelming part, I think when you push asset inventory, down, you tend to get very overwhelmed, especially during the commissioning startup phase. There's a lot of energization. You know, every time you integrate a system, like one of the smaller systems, into your main control system, there's just a lot of troubleshooting that always ends up happening. And it really, you know, it's not the best time to be saying, okay, well, we really got to start collecting different firmware versions, or we have to see what, you know, software is installed in this device. It just becomes very overwhelming and challenging. So, and then another part of this, a story from construction startup. You know, recently when I was at site supporting a startup team for implementing some of these systems, there's a central network that you know, had all their cyber services in the main DCS. So with that, you know, they had an asset management tool that was going to be, you know, we're just going to start sending network traffic and different logs, and it's going to start spitting out, you know, asset inventory information. But the challenge here is that you have, you know, you could have, and what happened in this case was the fiber backbone that was on this network. There was basically a big corridor at the facility that, you know, they were having cranes go back and forth through. And one of the fiber cables is, you know, below ground. One of the other fiber cables is above. It's going to be routed right in the path where this crane was going to be going. So they didn't want to put this second cable through, which means that the central kind of asset management tool was not able to communicate yet. And it would be several, you know, months before that would happen. So in all these cases, there's always going to be some type of manual asset data collections, and particularly, you know, as we're going through, like, you know, you're not going to be able to use you know, an automated tool when you're, you know, having all these different systems constructed at every different supplier's facility. So, you know, it becomes, you know, apparent that you have to start collecting. There's always going to be some kind of manual data collection. And also, not to be disparaging to any vendors' tools in this regard, I don't think I've ever used one of the OT cyber platforms or any kind of asset management tool that's 100% accurate, right, just by sending it traffic or logs. You know, you can send, you know, stuff to it. And I've seen where we had VMs that were an engineering workstation that got tagged as a VPN, or, you know, different things. So there's always going to be some kind of manual component. And I think that, you know, there is a really great opportunity to collect this data. And it kind of ties into one of the workshops, if you're at the CSAD and the CFAT workshop from Mike and Paul. I think this is really where this gets overlooked a lot. I don't know, has anybody ever participated in factory acceptance testing? I see some people. So I think, you know, there is the perception sometimes that, you know, and I know there is, you know, by, you know, design, there's like limited windows where you have these testing activities, and a lot of times you'll have, you know, your procurement group, and you'll have, you know, the suppliers, you know, engineering project manager, you know, focused on schedule. But if you actually attend one of these and you get to work with the people that are setting up these control cabinets or integrating the type of equipment, people are usually really reasonable about collecting this data. And then a lot of times your other requirements will inform or give you the opportunity to collect the data that you're looking for. So for example, if you have a requirement that you have to disable telnet on your network switches in a cabinet like this, you might have like a small industrial switch in there, and you don't want, you know, telnet to be an option. When you get into that switch, you know, one of the first things you'll see when you do the CLI is you'll see the firmware version, you know, right there. So I think this is the, the low risk opportunity to gather this data. If you're, earlier on, what we've been trying to do at Bechtel is to provide inventory templates prior to factory acceptance testing so that you can have some example rows filled out to say this is typically what we're looking for. And then when you get to FAT, it's really just making sure that, if there's missing pieces in that inventory that you can fill it in there, or, if there's a lot, then really this gives you the chance to complete that. And really, I think factory acceptance, it's much easier to, make changes or gather data, when it's at the supplier's facility versus when you get to site. When you get to site, a lot of times your site is in a very remote location. It's hard to get, equipment sent there, or, there's other just, depending on what is getting energized, it might be full steam ahead on something you don't have the opportunity to gather this data. And really, this last bullet here is supplementing the FAT team. So if you don't have the chance to write in a separate cyber factory acceptance test, what you can do, and I mean, it does require you to have this written into your specifications beforehand, but you would want to make sure that typically what we've been doing is we, will ask the supplier to provide the factory acceptance testing procedure. So once we get that procedure, we'll have a dialogue back and forth with them to say, these are the other types of checks that we want to do, on top, of just the normal functional testing. So once you go through that process and, document exactly what you want to do, there really is no surprises once you get to the factory acceptance testing. And if you can get an OT cyber engineer, so someone who's familiar with, IT and OT, that's ideal. But if you do have that procedure set up, it is a checkbox. And if you provide, some guidance to someone, or if you are able to remote support somebody, this is a way to gather this data. And this is just a very simple example of a CVE. So this is kind of informing when you're looking at what kind of data you want to gather on top of your normal asset information. This is exactly, just, if you go to one of these CVs or vendor advisory, for this communication module, it's like you want to know the make and model, the series, what have exited versions of the firmware. So that just starts to tell you what kind of fields that you need to populate in your asset inventory as you're going through. And engineers are, used to collecting inventory information. So with, different types of instrumentation, transmitters, final control elements, valves, pumps, motors, things like that, they have tools already that are there that collect all of this information. So you're really just supplementing some extra information. But one thing that engineers are used to is, having kind of a nesting kind of structure for the inventory. So you have, a parent tag, which could be an enclosure, or it could be a skid where, we have these type of valves or transmitters on the skid. So kind of similar to that, if you're looking at the different data that you have to capture, you can have hardware, virtual hardware, software, and the software can exist on either one of those. But if you want to tie this back into engineering and the 3D models, typically all of this, the components related to cybersecurity that we're concerned about will be in some type of enclosure cabinet. So that becomes your, your parent tag that, you can nest all of these together. And I think that's the, the approach to take as far as trying to track, these different advisories, because then, it becomes very easy to just capture all of this data and keep it consistent. as you're going through. So as far as, when you're getting towards the end of, preparing to turn over, and actually just as far as just going through all these different phases of EPC, traceability and configuration management are also a big part of the guidance and cyber, inventories. And, even with all this manual data collection, if you have that starting point at the FAT where you've collected all of this information, it becomes much less overwhelming to maintain it throughout those other phases of construction and startup. So if typically our startup engineers have action tracking tools. So when they go through any startup activity, they're tracking temporary modifications, they're tracking all the different site acceptance punch list items. And as they go through, they have a database of all these different actions that they're going through. So this is a good opportunity as they're going through. So if they have an action to update the firmware on a control module, that's a perfect chance that if you tie this data together in a database, you can just, when you make a change, it pushes right there, and you're maintaining this manual inventory over time. And anytime a change is made, you can reflect that as you're going through. And it really, I think, works relatively well as far as, when you don't have the automated tools to be able to track this. This is kind of the next best thing as far as just tracking this data. And really, I know a lot of the tools out there, you can start ingesting data to it, at the end of, your startup phase. So, if you are tracking this data all along, you don't have to really rush at the very end of the process to just try to sort out what your automated tool is collecting. You can load your data into it and start populating all this, so you have a more complete picture to turn over to whoever's going to operate your facility. And this is kind of, I've tested a few tools, and each of these tools kind of do these a little differently, but it does require a little bit of planning on how you're going to, like, whatever your customer's tool is going to end up being, you might have to adjust how you're collecting that data, or how you're going to take that data and push it into their tool. So I know you're probably thinking I can't know how to hear any more about inventories right now. So I think really, if you take anything away from the talk, it's really, if you're on the IT side, and you start to build your relationship with your engineers, just start, asking about factory acceptance testing, and just, inquire about, what kind of tests they do, and, how can we, incorporate, collecting the cyber asset data during factory acceptance, and, the highlighting how it is kind of low risk, activity. A recommendation I would have, and this might, be impractical for different size organizations, but I think having an OT cyber engineering group, someone under engineering that is kind of your middle ground between your IT and your controls or electrical and mechanical engineers, really helps out with, letting those different groups focus on their actual functional requirements, and allows someone who has more experience in both of those to be able to kind of translate between the two. And it really has helped out our group a lot with just being able to manage these requirements, because you're not kind of dumping it on top of, the other engineering requirements that they have to manage and implement. And this last one is really just, this is a question because I'm not as, familiar with like every single tool out there, but it can, as if you're going to be collecting this data manually throughout the EPC process as an engineering company, can we have a standardized way that we can, as if we're collecting all this data, to push it into all these platforms so we can enrich that, the data that you get from your different network or network feeds or log sources. I think if you can combine the two, it'll be, marrying, what you think it is, and then you can kind of compare as you, bring everything online. And, I think that will be, a way to better turn over these systems to our customers. So I did go through this a little quickly, but yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions. All right, thank you.